back on deportation flights and sending them into that madness. Does that make sense to you?
Well, first of all, the travel advisories for American citizens traveling there and the threats posed to Americans. What you're describing
why lift temporary protected status?
Well, the problem with temporary protective status was it was granted to so many people.
Senator Cory Booker didn't hold back. He accused Secretary Marco Rubio and the Trump administration of condemning Venezuela's human rights abuses while deporting Venezuelans back into the same dangerous conditions. As Booker declared, "I don't trust this administration," the hearing exploded into a fiery clash over hypocrisy, human rights, and immigration.
I want to pick up on my colleague's questioning because I actually know from years of conversations with you your heart about human rights in countries like Venezuela, Mr. Secretary. And you issued a travel warning, a level 4 travel advisory from your department's website that says, right now in Venezuela, there's a high risk of wrongful detention, torture, terrorism, kidnapping, arbitrary enforcement of laws, crime, and more. And when we hear from the president that he is in charge, that you all are running this government to that extent, I have a lot of concerns when it comes to the rampant human rights violations that are persisting. Cabello is Maduro's key hardline enforcer. He's continued to intimidate and suppress Venezuelan voices. He remains in control of Venezuela's security forces, security services, the colectivos. We're seeing extraordinary examples that the constant oppression of the people is continuing as these folks are remaining in control of the country. So I just want to know, what is the plan to address in a much more aggressive manner these severe human rights violations and to try to stop these armed militias? Because if we are doing things to stabilize their government, if we're turning over resources and money to the very groups that are creating these horrors, that seems to me against America's values, and it seems to me something that should be unacceptable to Congress on both sides.
Yeah, well, absolutely. The Venezuela I described that we want to see emerge from this is one in which none of that is happening. If you think about travel advisories are us imagining worst-case scenarios. We have a duty to warn American citizens when they travel to a place that does have a history of Americans being arrested, of Americans being taken. And they may be taken by a deliberate action of a government or entity related to the regime. They may be taken by criminal gangs that control parts of that society. For example, you have these colectivos, as they're called, which basically are these armed motorcycle gangs that are allowed to act with impunity in return for their support for the Maduro regime in the past. You have the ELN and the FARC and other drug trafficking organizations, including Tren de Aragua, that are involved.
Again.
So these are real risks that we have a duty to warn Americans, because here's what we didn't want to see, and don't mean to interrupt you. We have this announcement that Maduro's been taken. All of a sudden, people conclude, oh, he's gone, let's flood over there, let's all go over there, and we could expose people to danger.
But this is the hypocrisy that I see. At the same time that you're issuing these human rights cautions about what's going on there for Americans, you have a president that's lifting temporary protected status for Venezuelans. Many of them are individuals that have lived in our country for years, if not decades. When I hear from the Venezuelan community, I hear an outrage that at the very same time that you are affirming here that these armed militias are running around suppressing voices, we have an administration that has said very clearly that they're not only going to be lifting temporary protected status for Venezuelans living in the U.S., but instead of protecting longtime American residents, they are, quote, the administration is putting people back on deportation flights and sending them into that madness. Does that make sense to you?
Well, first of all, the travel advisories for American citizens traveling there and the threats posed to Americans. What you're describing
why lift temporary protected status?
Well, the problem with temporary protective status was it was granted to so many people in such a vast numbers so quickly without proper vetting by the previous administration that there's a real concern that there were gang members that had received TPS simply because of the nation they came from and the time in which they came. It became so big and so massive. The overwhelming majority of Venezuelans are not members of Tren de Aragua, but there were Tren de Aragua and other criminal elements embedded in the TPS system. And the numbers were so large that the administration felt it had to cancel the program in order to appropriately vet it through on the individual cases.
Excuse me, Mr. Secretary, this might not surprise you. I don't trust this administration and the way they use terms like terrorist. I've seen them calling American citizens domestic terrorists who are people trying to peacefully protest. The problem we have right now is the administration continues to make policies that seem to contradict their words, and yet we don't have a process in place for Congress to do its job because people are not calling folks in for these hearings and not providing the kind of oversight that we need. It is very frustrating to me that we still have a repressive regime in power in Venezuela suppressing human rights, yet we are cooperating with them, we are funding them, and we're not calling out the ridiculousness of the violence that's going on there. At the same time, we're taking people who have lived in our country for years and years and years and sending them back into that hell where they can be targeted, where they can be abducted, where they can be held for hostage because they know they have American family members that are still here. This is a situation ripe for where we are being complicit in continuing human rights violations, and that needs to stop. And I think
just on 2 points. We're not cooperating with them to continue doing what they're doing now. We're cooperating with them to transition away from what's happening now. And as I said, we're not even 4 weeks into this thing. And if it continues to look like this in 6 months, 9 months, a year from now, if progress isn't being made, we'll have very different feelings about it. But what we're cooperating on is not the continuation of what's happening. It's a movement away from all this and transitioning ultimately to something that looks nothing like this. That's the goal. But it's been less than 4 weeks. I mean, we think we've made substantial progress in a very short period of time. But I acknowledge we want to make a lot more progress. This is not the end state that we want.
One of the most revealing exchanges of the hearing came when Senator Cory Booker challenged Secretary Marco Rubio over what he described as a major contradiction in the Trump administration's Venezuela policy. Booker began by reminding Rubio of something they had long agreed on throughout their years in the Senate: the Maduro regime has committed serious human rights abuses against the Venezuelan people. He cited the State Department's own Level 4 travel advisory, which warns Americans about arbitrary detention, torture, terrorism, kidnapping, violent crime, and widespread repression inside Venezuela. Booker argued that if the administration itself considers Venezuela too dangerous for Americans to visit, it makes little sense to deport Venezuelans who have built lives in the United States back into those same dangerous conditions. He also pointed to continued reports that Maduro's security forces, armed militias known as colectivos, and criminal organizations continue to intimidate civilians and suppress dissent. Booker asked Rubio what the administration planned to do to stop these abuses while questioning why Venezuelans already living safely in the United States were losing temporary protected status. Rubio responded that the administration shares the goal of seeing a democratic Venezuela free from repression. He explained that the travel advisory exists to warn Americans about the dangers posed by criminal gangs, armed militias, and the Maduro regime. But when Booker pressed him about ending temporary protected status, Rubio defended the decision by arguing that the Biden administration had granted TPS to such large numbers of Venezuelans that proper vetting became impossible. According to Rubio, officials believed some members of the Tren de Aragua criminal organization had entered the program, making it necessary to end it and review cases individually. Booker rejected that explanation. He argued that the overwhelming majority of Venezuelans living in the United States are law-abiding families who fled dictatorship, not gang members. He accused the Trump administration of using broad national security claims to justify policies that place innocent people at risk. Booker said he no longer trusted the administration's repeated use of labels like terrorist, arguing that similar language has been used against peaceful protesters and political opponents. He warned that Congress has struggled to conduct meaningful oversight because administration officials have not consistently answered lawmakers' questions. He said it was contradictory for the administration to publicly acknowledge Venezuela's widespread human rights violations while simultaneously sending longtime Venezuelan residents back into those same dangerous conditions. According to Booker, deported individuals could face kidnapping, retaliation, or persecution simply because they have ties to family members living in the United States. Rubio pushed back. He insisted the United States is not cooperating with the Maduro government to preserve the current system but rather to encourage a transition away from authoritarian rule. He argued that diplomatic efforts had only recently begun and asked lawmakers to allow more time before judging the administration's strategy. Booker remained unconvinced. He argued that until meaningful democratic reforms actually occur inside Venezuela, sending vulnerable people back into the country risks making the United States complicit in ongoing human rights abuses. He closed by insisting that America's immigration policies should reflect the same concerns about democracy and human rights that its foreign policy publicly promotes. The exchange highlighted two sharply different approaches to Venezuela. Rubio defended the administration's emphasis on security, vetting, and diplomatic engagement, while Booker argued that protecting people fleeing oppression must remain central to America's values.